to respect your time. So thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Michelle Kusa. On behalf of the OMLA board, just welcome. We are super grateful that you gave up your evening just to learn and grow with us. This virtual professional development series has been a great way to connect with educators across the state this year and grow during such trying times. So for those of you who have been joining, we've been doing these monthly since August. And again, it's just been a great opportunity to connect with people all across the state and learn and grow and go through all of this craziness together. We are going to begin wrapping up our virtual series for the year. We're super excited to have Dr. Sierra Austin with us this month and next month for a two-part series on implicit bias, social identity, conflict, and power. It's an area that we can all continue to learn and grow and just keep learning how we can best serve our students and our families and our communities. So we're really excited that she's with us for the next 2 months. So if you have colleagues and people who couldn't make it tonight, please feel free to share the video and then make sure that they join us next month. Part 2 will be on April 20th at the same time, 7 p.m. Now, as much as we have really enjoyed the virtual PD, we are also super excited to be hosting an in-person conference this May. We have postponed our October 2020 fall conference. We had originally postponed it till March and then moved it to May. We really were dedicated to holding an in-person conference this year. So that is a go, May 6th and 7th at Kalahari in Sandusky. We will be meeting for 2 days. Kalahari has great safety protocols in place. It's a huge conference center if you've ever been there. Lots of room to space out. We're really looking at which rooms we use and set up and everything. So just be assured that we are doing everything we can to make sure that everybody is safe and comfortable, but that we can also reconnect and re-engage and hopefully refresh at the end of this year. This has been quite an exhausting year on so many levels, and so this will be a really nice way in May that hopefully you're done with testing, whatever that looks like this year, that we can really just reconnect and learn some great new strategies, things that happened this year, and some ideas that we can bring into next year. So we hope that you can join us at our conference May 6th and 7th at Kalahari. Early bird registration, there is a discount for that ends next week. So make sure you get your registrations in before spring break, before you head out next week. We are also running an OMLA pop-up shop for some gear. So if you're looking for some new OMLA gear, you can order online. It will be shipped directly to your house. That way, if you can't make it to conference this spring, you'll have it in time for the fall. But we will be having a few special raffles at our spring conference if you're sporting some of your new gear. There's some great options on there. I know I ordered a ball cap and some joggers today, but you can check out the pop-up shop. Again, check out the last of the virtual series that we have to offer, and then also hope to see you in May. Lastly, our awards for 2021 have already closed out, but we are still offering mini grants. That application is still open for another month or two. So if there's a great program that you're looking to try in your building and you need some funding for that, we offer mini grants to individual teachers, teams, and buildings to try new things. So you can check out our website, www.ohiomla.org, to find that mini grant application. And with that, just 2 more housekeeping items before I turn it over to Dr. Austin. There will be a recording sent out with a CEU certificate after tonight's session. So again, feel free to share that with your colleagues so that they have a chance to, view the video, share it with your administrators and or the teachers in your building. Also, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can just type that in the chat, and we'll kind of monitor that and find good times to answer those questions. And if there's something that we don't answer, I'll make sure that I get all those to Dr. Austin to answer in the next session. And with all of that, we are ready to turn it over to Dr. Austin. So I'd like to just read a short little bio so you get a little background on her. Dr. Sierra Austin is the ESC's Regional School Improvement Coordinator for Equity and Diversity. She's a graduate of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at The Ohio State University with a focus on race and social justice. She also graduated with an interdisciplinary specialization in Latino studies. Sierra's research, done in Columbus City Schools, activism and work focuses on education equity and prioritizes operationalizing intersectional approaches to social change. So thank you, Dr. Austin, for being with us tonight and for doing a two-part series. We really appreciate your time, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Michelle. I'm very excited to be here this evening. So as Michelle mentioned, if there are any questions, ideas, or thoughts that come up, please feel free to put those in the chat box. I am also super informal, so this is a smaller group. So if we want to maybe even unmute if you feel compelled to ask something or to get clarity on something, please feel free to do that. I want this to be a dialogue because the topic is so tough. And so I really want us to feel as comfortable as possible during this session and the next one to ask questions, to share your thoughts, etc. So please utilize the chat box and feel free to stop me anytime. I promise I will not get offended at all. All right, so I am going to share my screen. And just want to start by sharing an agenda of how we'll spend the next hour or so together. So I've done some introductions and I'll talk a little bit about housekeeping, things that I'm sure you've heard before in all of the Zoom presentations we've been participating in the past year. We'll talk a little bit about implicit bias, and then we'll talk about how implicit bias kind of shapes all of the structural inequities that we've seen kind of come to the fore in education and politics and society, et cetera, over the past year. And then we'll talk about what we can do to kind of interrupt some of those biases and some of the structural inequities that we're seeing in our classrooms and in our buildings. And then we'll wrap up. So that's a lot to cover in about an hour, but I'll do my best. And luckily, we have another session. So we'll make sure that we get to everything. As Michelle mentioned, my name is Sierra Austin. I am Regional School Improvement Coordinator for Diversity and Equity at the ESC. I've been there for about 2 years. Prior to that, I taught a social justice elective at the middle school level for a local charter school, which was an awesome experience. I got to develop the curriculum for that class and actually teach young change makers about ideas related to social justice and equity. Also have spent some time in academia. So as Michelle mentioned, my grad work was done in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at Ohio State, as well as in the College of Ed. And so I currently still hold a few teaching appointments. So one of those is at Ohio State. So I teach a class or two every semester. And I also teach in the Writing, Literature, and Philosophy department at Columbus College of Art and Design. All right, so some housekeeping items. So again, I know that the topic that we're talking about is not an easy one. No one should feel comfortable talking about implicit bias or structural racism or white supremacy or any of these topics, right? So please understand that the goal is not necessarily comfortability, but just to create a courageous space where we can have dialogue about some of these things. Just want to say that it's important to honor multiple perspectives. So we all have different backgrounds, different experiences, and that's going to inform the way we take in the information this evening. So let's make sure that we're respectful of other folks' perspectives. course, let me know, or let Michelle or Rob know, or John, if there are any tech issues, and we'll work to get that resolved on our end. Take care of yourself. So again, if things get kind of heavy for you, you need to take a break, you need to get water, you need to turn your camera off, please feel free to do so, and take care of yourself as needed. And then lastly, accept and expect the absence of closure. So again, we'll be talking about structural racism and structural inequity, things that have been built into the fabric of our country from the beginning of time. So we're talking about a legacy, a centuries old legacy of multiple forms of oppression. And we certainly will not be able to, unfortunately, solve these problems in an hour. So please accept that we won't be able to do that, but that we're just kind of starting. And yeah, I know it'll be overwhelming. All right, so I want to start by defining implicit bias. So over the past year or so, we've been hearing a lot about implicit bias, right? And so sometimes we take for granted that folks actually know what that is, right? So easily defined, implicit bias is a concept based on an existing body of cognitive and neurological research that explores how we subconsciously organize information in our brains, right? So it's the hard sciences, and it deals with how we categorize and store information subconsciously in our brains. Okay. So implicit bias affects how individuals' attitudes and actions create real-world implications, despite us being completely unaware that these biases exist within ourselves. So we all have implicit biases, right? So it doesn't matter what our race is, what our gender is, what our sexual orientation is, what ability status we hold, what our religious affiliations are. We all have implicit biases, right? And so the shame should not come from acknowledging that we have them, but rather knowing that we have them and not doing anything to disrupt them. So one of the tools that I always suggest for finding out where those implicit biases lie is the Harvard Implicit Association Test, which I'm sure lots of folks have probably heard of. But it's a free assessment that you can take online, and it's not going to ask you your name or your employer or anything like that. But you can take the Harvard IAT online in about 20 minutes or so, based upon multiple categories of identity. Again, so race, sexual orientation, religion, etc. And it'll give you kind of a baseline idea of where your biases lie. And in doing that, you'll be able to kind of consciously work to disrupt them. So highly encourage everyone to take that IAT. Even if you've taken it before and it's been a while, I still suggest that you take it again because your results can change over time. So keep that in mind as well. So when we think about implicit biases, it's important to think about our own identities and our own backgrounds and how they shape those biases. So psychologists estimate that our brains are bombarded with about 11 million bits of information every second, right? So that's a lot of information. Realistically, we can process only about 40 pieces, right? Between 20 and 40, right? So that's a huge gap, right? So what our brain attempts to do at the cognitive level is create these shortcuts, right? So that we can kind of take in as much information as possible. However, the problem with that is those shortcuts, again, are kind of rooted in our own identities and our own experiences and our own thoughts, right? And they can create those biases, these negative assumptions about people that are discriminatory in nature, right? So our own identities and experiences help us categorize these all of this information, but we can actually do so in a way that's harmful and problematic, right? So think about how that might play out in your classroom. Think about how that may play out in your building, in the community that you live, right? So I want to draw our attention to this idea of critical literacies as we're thinking about identity and implicit bias. So when we hear the term literacy, often we think about reading, we think about writing, we think about something that might be measured on a test, an assessment, etc. But the National Council of Teachers of English has done a lot of work around this idea of critical literacies. And so when they say critical, what we mean is a lens, right, that we can use to analyze issues of identity, issues of power, issues of privilege, issues of marginalization and oppression, right? So critical literacies is defined as diverse students' cultural knowledge drawn from inside the classroom, the students' everyday worlds, their homes, their communities, and their funds of knowledge, right? So this is kind of a fancy way of saying that although students might not have the language to articulate issues related to race and racism, or issues related to class and classism, or issues related to homophobia or transphobia or anything like that, right? Holding these identities, particularly these marginalized identities, gives them a special view of the world, right? And this doesn't just apply to our students, but also ourselves, right? So our identities and experiences shape how we move around the world and how we experience the world on a day-to-day basis, right? So that influences how we watch TV and what we take away from what we're seeing, what you'll take away from this presentation today, what we take away from conversations that we have with colleagues or friends, right? And so, this is really important. And so when we think about critical literacies, we don't often give students spaces to talk about issues like social justice or race or class or ability, et cetera. And while these identities and experiences might not be measured or valued kind of in traditional school context, they're super important to how our students experience education, right? So do they feel welcome in the classroom space? Do they feel included, right? Very important to think about, right? And so this is a type of literacy, right, that they develop. They develop their own ideas about what we've witnessed, for example, in the last year around policing and race and racism, et cetera. But we're just not kind of asking them those questions. So I'm going to embarrass myself here. These are photos of me that I dug out for this presentation today. But the photo on the left was taken when I was in preschool. And so, of course, as a preschool student, I didn't have the language to say, I feel isolated because I am the only student of color in the class, or I'm the only African-American girl in the class, right? And that experience, was very isolating, right? And it helped me to develop certain ideas about inclusivity and belonging, even though I couldn't articulate them in the way that I'm articulating them now, right? So I was developing those critical literacies about what does it mean to be the only Black girl in a space? What does it mean to be the only Black girl in a space at a Catholic school who's not Catholic, right? So these are all really important kind of identity, kind of politics that we kind of expect our students to navigate, although they don't necessarily have the language. So this educational experience and a lot of the other ones that I had after this kind of shaped my view of schooling in a lot of ways. And I would say in such a way that inspired me to attend a historically Black college when it was time to go to undergrad, right? So to be in spaces where people looked like me and affirmed my culture and my heritage, et cetera. So all of those things kind of shape the biases that we have, right? And again, we all have them. So this iceberg is a cool metaphor, I think, that really kind of breaks down the hard science stuff about implicit bias. And I am in no way a hard science person, so this probably helps me more than it helps you all. But scientists encourage us to think about the brain as an iceberg. And so you'll see here that we do the bulk of our thinking at that subconscious level, so 90%, which is huge. So that's where those implicit biases lie. That's where our beliefs lie, our emotions, our values, our habits, etc. Conversely, we only do 10% of our thinking at the conscious level. So that's where we house critical thinking, logical thinking, etc. And together, these are what scientists call system 1 and system 2. Together, these two systems help us make sense of the world around us. So system 1, where we do only 10% of our conscious thinking, happens really fast. So if you think about if you're driving in a car, for example, and you see the traffic light turn from green to yellow, you know, instinctively to slow down, right? You don't have to put much thought into that. Conversely, system 2 takes a lot more time, a lot more focus, and a lot more concentration. Hence why it takes time to disrupt, right, implicit biases and beliefs that might be problematic and discriminatory in some way, right? Because that is in that subconscious mind, right? And so disrupting those patterns, those habits, those biases takes a lot of continual self-reflective type of work, right? So I've said a lot of things. Are there any questions, any thoughts? If not, that's okay. But if there are, feel free to drop them in the chat or feel free to stop me at any time. All right, so I want to share a quick video about implicit bias. And in the video, implicit biases are referred to as blind spots. So I don't think you'll explicitly hear the term implicit bias, but you will hear blind spots. And the video is just going to recap some of the science that I've gone through and talk about the dangers of implicit bias or blind spots and what we lose when we don't welcome diversity, when we don't prioritize inclusion, and when we don't seek to disrupt our biases. So let's take a look.
Are you seriously considering her as a candidate?
Just don't trust her.
She's a woman.
She's a woman.
This is a man's
Look at him, he's
job.
clearly not educated.
Really? Does she even speak English?
That's not me. I'm not like that. You call it an honest mistake. Science calls it a blind spot. Our unconscious mind is a mysterious and powerful thing. It makes 90% of our decisions without us even knowing it. Our brains are overloaded with 11 million pieces of information every second. Yet we can only process about 40 of them. So we're wired to make cognitive shortcuts, using past experiences to make assumptions. And you know what happens when we assume. Our unconscious mind can put us on autopilot, determining where we sit, who we eat lunch with, who we turn to for advice, and who we choose to offer a helping hand. Living our lives with blind spots can put us in a tunnel. Same point of view, same decisions, same outcomes. We can find ourselves trapped in the land of snap judgments and misconceptions. We've all been on both the giving and receiving end of blind spots. Think about it. Who's talented? Who's able? Who can I trust? Who belongs? We've all been there. Blind spots are part of the human condition. Our choices have consequences for us and the people we interact with. By accepting that blind spots exist, we can stop. Imagine what possibilities exist if we could do it all over again. Different perspectives, inclusive relationships, diverse networks, better outcomes, seeing people for who they really are. People like you, with unlimited potential. We all have blind spots. Once you accept that you have them, you can choose to do something about it. It's time to check your blind spots and focus on what's possible.
All right, so please feel free to drop any general reactions to the video in the chat, or you can, of course, unmute, but any salient ideas, any aha moments, please feel free to share those with us as you see fit. Right, so while we're maybe thinking about what we saw in the video and processing, wanted to share this graphic as well. And so what this graphic does is kind of show us the linkage between implicit bias and structural racism. And so obviously we see racism here, but this is also applicable to like other forms of oppression, right, that exist on a structural level. So what this graphic kind of forces us to do is to think about how those harmful or problematic ideas that kind of start or are housed here at the micro level or at the individual level kind of get out into the world, right, into our policies, into our procedures, into the rules that we're governed by, and create really inequitable outcomes for particular groups of people. So you'll see priming, associations, and assumptions, and you'll see like a newspaper and a TV here. And so we get a lot of our ideas and assumptions about different groups of people from the media that we consume, right? So what we see on social media, what we might see on TV, right? A lot of times they're very harmful stereotypes too, might I add, right? So then you see histories, policies, and practices, right? So when we think about the founding of this country and, for example, how people of the African diaspora or African Americans, indigenous peoples were treated, right? Those implicit biases about these groups of people being inferior, right, were written into law, right? Written into the systems that govern us. And so what that creates over generations and generations and generations are these inequitable outcomes and disparities that we see kind of at the bottom of the graphic. So that can look like mass incarceration, for example. It can look like the achievement gap and disproportionate disciplining in schools, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the presentation. But all of these ideas about who belongs, who's inferior, who's superior, et cetera, literally get written, even sometimes unintentionally, right, into the very policy and procedures that govern us, right? And so we're talking about centuries and a legacy of this type of thing. And so when we hear statements like equity is a journey, right, it certainly is, because we're talking about disrupting systems that have been in place longer than any of us have been here, right? And so it's also important to think that we shouldn't blame people, right, but blame systems, right? And so also wanted to just provide a kind of quick definition of structural or systemic racism. So like implicit bias, this is a term that we're hearing a lot, and we've heard it a lot over the past year or so. Sometimes take for granted that we know what it means, right? So it's the normalization of an array of dynamics, so historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal, that routinely produce cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color, right? So historical, cultural, and interpersonal, they're cumulative, right, over time, that systematically, right, you get that from the word systemic, produce adverse outcomes for people of color. So I have another video that I want to show. Chronicles two fictional characters named Kevin and Jamal. And the video is going to explain or define structural racism again. And it's going to give an example of how that kind of plays out in educational contexts, particularly around home ownership and zip codes, and how that really mediates students' experiences with school, right? So we're talking about specifically how systemic racism manifests in school. This is also going to talk about how it manifests in other places, like in our banking systems, right? And talk about how it is kind of tied to our zip codes and the way we fund schools and property taxes, etc. So let's take a peek.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace. This
All right. So just a few quick takeaways from the video. So we know there's a deep connection between property taxes and school funding. If you need a definition for redlining, I've got one here. So it's a discriminatory practice by which government agencies divide and label areas as desirable or undesirable for investment based upon demographic makeup. So one of the kind of most historically racially segregated cities in the country is Chicago. Central Ohio has a long history of redlining. Columbus has a very long history of redlining, but I would say in the Midwest generally, there is a very, very long-lasting legacy of redlining. We know from the video that we can inherit vastly different circumstances based upon our racial or ethnic identity and our socioeconomic status. We know a big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. We also know that systemic racism is evident in nearly all aspects of life, so not just education, but the accumulation of wealth, mass incarceration, representation, etc. And so one of my favorite kind of lines from the video and thinking about just how deep this problem is that there's no single person or entity responsible, right? Which makes it hard to solve, right? Because it permeates kind of every facet of our life. So I'm going to stop sharing. I see there's some things going on in the chat box, so we can address those. And if anyone wants to unmute and say anything, we can do that too. Okay, Zach, I have a map for you. I'm pulling it up right now. So this is one of my favorite resource maps to use if anyone wants to take a look at that. And thanks for folks who are sharing links also.
If you don't mind, I'll pop in real quick. I'm Meredith Stanton. I'm from North Royalton Middle School.
Okay.
I find this topic very interesting. We've actually been doing a book study in our middle school with one of our our principals, actually, whoever chose to do the book study with Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. And so listening to you talk we've talked about some of these things through that whole book study and talking, and it's been very interesting with the group of people that have chosen to do this, because we've chosen to do this, chosen to talk about this sensitive topic, and it's really waking us up, I think, some of us, and our thoughts and what we've have not realized, what some of those biases have been, or how we grew up and what our parents or grandparents or however they were, either their behaviors or how their views have built our views, or and what we're doing. So I'm connecting it all as you're talking, and connecting some of those things that we've discussed, and how really fortunate that we've had administrators that have opened up this discussion and offered this opportunity for some of our teachers, and who is willing to do it. So I was very interested in listening to you talk today. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So you've kind of, you got to start somewhere. And the difficult thing with like structural oppression is that in order to create change, like it requires a lot of critical like self-reflection. So you have to like constantly be checking yourself, right? And so it's great that we have PDs, it's great that we have training, but there's really like a super heightened level of like personal accountability that you like always have to be checking your privilege, always have to be checking your implicit bias, because that's kind of what shapes the rules that govern our classrooms or our buildings and our society, etc. Any other thoughts? Josh, thanks for posting another map for us. Jenny says, do you have? Oh, yeah.
Hey, Sierra, I know we're just scratching the surface tonight. Do you have any suggestions for maybe those in attendance who this might be their first encounter with this topic, or maybe This is not their first encounter, but they're trying to figure out how to introduce that maybe at their middle school or in their district, or even how do you even start to talk with kids? Do you have just any general things or maybe a starting point? Again, I know we're not going to have any answers, but maybe just some suggestions to moving forward.
Yeah, so I have a ton of research banks, and I have everything divided up by topic and grade level. So I'm happy to share out some resources for folks who are just getting started, or folks who have been doing, this work for some time. So I'll make sure that I kind of share those with you and Michelle, so that everybody has those.
Thank you. We'll get that in the recording, and with your certificate, we can send some of those out together. Thank
Okay.
you.
Sounds good. And I'm going to share. Did I cut someone off?
Funding. Sorry, there was another question too. You had just started to touch upon about funding. It said, do you ever see a future where someone takes that control or responsibility and starts from school funding to start to lessen these gaps? Or is that not really a good starting point until people all start recognizing implicit biases they have?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I had a similar presentation right before this. And so one of the quotes in the video, the speaker says, systemic problems require systemic solutions. And someone shared in my previous presentation that Evanston, Illinois today or yesterday approved reparations for Black residents. So when we talk about that accumulation of wealth and who's had access to wealth, like that is an example, right? A very radical example of ways to kind of really remedy this legacy of structural oppression. So I'm going to drop this link in the chat. It's from NPR, and I didn't know about this till about an hour ago, but that is a systemic solution, right? So that's an example of one. I see you've got some other book study titles popping into the chat, so please keep those coming as well. We've got just a few more slides to go, and I do have a resource slide, so I can show you at least one valuable and current resource toward the end of the presentation. All right, so I'm going to share my screen again. So this is another kind of fact about structural or systemic racism, and this idea that systemic racism or systemic oppression requires systemic solutions, right? So what systemic racism does not mean is that there's simply a lot of racist individuals in a system, in a culture, or in a country. It means that even if there are 0 racist individuals present, the system would still function to disproportionately harm certain groups of people. And I think that's really, really important, right? So when we think about issues of race or marginalization and achieving equitable outcomes, right? We talk about, interventions like, professional development or book studies, et cetera, which are phenomenal, right? And we want those things. But even if we were to eradicate or pinpoint who are the people that are really have these explicit biases, are really trying to harm children, are really trying to harm their colleagues, we've got to get them out of here, right? The systems that we're governed by are designed, right, to disproportionately harm certain groups of people, right? So that's why I was saying earlier, like, we really have to look at systems rather than individuals. So you might have heard the term, the system is failing us, or it's failing students of color, when really the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, right? Was public education kind of set up for students of color and poor students to succeed? No, right? So we have to kind of shift our mindset to think, the system isn't failing us, right? The system is doing what it was designed to do, right? And that's not just about education, but the way our country is governed as a whole. So this is a Toni Morrison quote that I really, really like. So I'm sure everyone here has heard of Toni Morrison, Nobel Peace Prize winner, phenomenal author and activist. But Toni Morrison said, there is no such thing as race, none. There's just a human race, scientifically, anthropologically. Racism is a construct, a social construct. It has a social function, right? And so I like this quote because it reminds us that race is a social construct, right? There's nothing like organic or natural about this idea of racism or social hierarchy where some people have more power and privilege than others. Race is literally made up, right? It's a made up kind of mechanism to categorize people, right? And limit people's access to resources and opportunities, right? So it literally is a social construction. It literally is made up, right? And although it's made up, obviously there are some very real and very dangerous consequences. But I think it's important to know that this thing that we're talking about was constructed, right, to demoralize and dehumanize. And in some ways, it's not even a real thing, right? All right, and what this graphic shows us is kind of the levels at which different forms of racism exist. So if you look at the very bottom, there's internalized. So that's where that's like that micro individual race-based beliefs and feelings within individuals. You've got the interpersonal level. So those are where those biases and microaggressions get enacted, right? So how individuals kind of move through word and action. And then you've got institutional, which are discriminatory policies and practices within organizations and institutions. And we've got that bigger, kind of larger systemic, right? That's the ongoing racial inequities maintained by society. So all of these things are like happening at the same time to kind of uphold the systemic or that big macro level, right? So there are levels, right? And it manifests differently at each level. So this is a wheel of power and privilege, and I'm happy to share the slide deck as well. But essentially what this gets us to think about is our own identities and the identities of those that we might work with and teach every day. So we talked about how kind of race was constructed or made up to create this hierarchy of people, right? So who will have power, who will have access to resources, to opportunity, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So as you can see, if you look in the middle of this circle, you'll see the word power. And within kind of that inner circle, these are the individuals who historically have had the most social and political power, right? So we see that the race is white. We see that those are able-bodied folks. Those tend to be cis men, people with money that own property, that are straight, right, etc. So this is we call the mythical norm, right? So this is kind of the standard who has, again, the most power and the most privilege. As you kind of move out toward the outer kind of edges of the circle, you can see who is marginalized, who has the least political and social power. So I'll give everybody a minute to kind of just process what they see here. So you can think about where you are, where the students that you work with are, where the people in your community are. And so just like we all have implicit biases, right? We all have some degree of privilege as well. So that could be ability privilege, it could be racial privilege, it can be orientation privilege, right? And so again, the shame is not in having these privileges, but we should be thinking about what we can do to kind of disrupt the status quo and give other people access to power as well, and opportunities and resources. All right, so the grand scheme of things, I talked about privilege, but also wanted to provide a definition for that. And I'm taking this definition from a scholar named Peggy McIntosh. So she wrote an article in 1989 called The Invisible Knapsack. Some people may have heard about that, but it's all about the privileges that she experiences on a day-to-day basis as a white woman, and how it took her a very long time to realize that she had those privileges. But she defines privileges as a special right, immunity, or benefit granted only to particular groups. And she calls privilege an invisible package of unearned assets that can be cashed in daily. So she gives a long laundry list of privileges. And she talks about, for example, being able to go to the store and finding Band-Aids in the same color as your skin tone, right? I mean, I can do it, but it's very, very hard. There is, I think, 2 physical stores that I know that I can go to and do that. But she talks about how even being able to find Band-Aids in flesh color is a privilege, right? Being able to go in a store and shop without feeling as though you're being followed or considered to be suspicious. Being able to turn the TV on and seeing people of your race widely represented. So again, she gives us a long laundry list of privileges that we oftentimes don't even think about. So the essay focuses on race, but she also tackles some other categories of identity as well. So when we think about these implicit biases that we all have, these privileges that we all to some degree have, these are kind of the small, everyday, micro level things that still very much inform and have bearing on these larger social inequities that we see, right? And again, this is kind of the system on which our country was founded. So we've got our work cut out ahead of us in terms of disrupting and dismantling these things. But it really speaks to what the individual can do, right? That critical self-reflection and how you are seeking to disrupt and how important that is to creating change. So I see that there were some things in the chat box. Rob or Michelle, anything I should see? I can't pull up my chat box for some reason.
Yeah, there was a good question that says, do you have any resources or suggestions that can help us look at our own systems within our districts to make changes? It says, thinking about that quote about how systemic racism isn't about the individuals, but the system itself. We may have things in place that we don't even realize are affecting kids in our schools. So I know earlier you talked about that Harvard IAT, and I think that was more of like an individual test, but do you have any resources for schools that they could look at things within their structure? I think the question is asking that maybe we don't even realize.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I have 2 audits. They're like equity audits and assessment. So they cover things like achievement, they cover things like discipline. So you can kind of work through the audit questions and kind of see, where are we falling short that we might not have even thought about. And it's a good way to kind of assess where some inequities might be. So I can share those too.
Great, thank you.
All right, so speaking of discipline, I have another quick video. I think it's literally like 2 minutes or less, so I think we're okay on time. But it kind of speaks to the ways our implicit biases can inform discipline practices, specifically for students of color. And so that is an area, of course, which is very important to pay attention to when we're thinking about how this gets enacted and we may not even know about it. So let's take a quick peek.
Hi, Mom. It's me. I got in trouble again at school today.
Hi, this is Miss Jones again. I'm finding your son very disruptive in class, more so than other students.
I feel like the teacher doesn't like me. Other kids do bad things, but they don't get in trouble.
He's defiant and shows a real lack of respect for any structure or authority.
I hate school because the teachers are always mean to me and I don't feel like I'm learning anything.
I'm really concerned about his behavior.
I'm always getting in trouble for what I didn't do.
We're going to have to adopt a zero tolerance policy, young man.
School keeps calling my mother and she gets really, really mad at me.
What is going on? You'd better explain.
I feel like the whole world is just turned up against me and doesn't like me anymore. There are days I get up and I just decide I'm not going to school.
And we go to the park. Like, everybody's always telling me I'm not worth anything, so what's the point of trying?
I know the cops are watching us, but we just hope we don't get caught.
Your son's absences are a problem. They will definitely affect his grade point average.
I don't feel safe in my class anymore.
Should I assume you're unprepared again today?
I would always eventually get picked on by the teacher. He makes examples of me.
I feel really singled out, and I just try to avoid people because every time I look, somebody's always talking about me. Oh, she's always getting in trouble.
But I started fighting more because nobody wants to hang out around a troublemaker. The only time I have real friends is when I'm on the block. So that's where I'll stay.
I'm sure you understand we take our discipline policies very seriously here at the school. What are we going to do about your son?
I know we're probably processing. That's a pretty emotional kind of TED Talk live short. But does anyone have any kind of thoughts or reactions that they want to share out loud or maybe in the chat box? I think this is a good illustration of disproportionate discipline and that school to prison pipeline, right? That is very much rooted in systemic racism. So you see the statistics about African American and Latinx students. So any thoughts? And if not, that's okay. I know it's a lot to process. All right, so I did want to share this document. I certainly won't read it all, and I'll make sure everyone has access to it, but it's 6 things school staff can do to interrupt unconscious bias. So they're pretty simple things, again, heavy on the self-reflection. Noticing, in order to interrupt our racial and other biases, we have to first become aware of them. So that's where that Harvard IAT comes in. Number 2 is listen, right? So slowing down your interactions and deeply listening, right? 3 is reflecting. So it sounds like a lot of folks are doing this already, but reading, discussing, journaling, book studies, etc. Seems like a lot of that is already going on, which is great. Connecting, so building in time to dialogue with your students, with your colleagues about issues of identity and how to affirm folks' identities. Number 5 is affirm, right? So don't need to say much about that one. And then 6 is act, which I really like. Practice slowing down, noticing your biases and looking at those patterns. And again, this is an ongoing, process, right? It's not going to happen overnight because again, we're socialized and bombarded with lots of information, stereotypical information, a lot of times about different groups of people. All right, so one of the resources that I wanted to highlight is Learning for Justice, formerly Teaching for Tolerance. So I'm sure a lot of folks have heard about Teaching for Tolerance. It's been around for quite some time. This video is also very short, but I just wanted to share this. This has wonderful conversation starters, lesson planning tools, all around DEI and social justice. So for example, if you do something with students or colleagues around implicit bias, it's here. If you want to spark a conversation among students and colleagues about the violence that we're seeing in AAPI communities right now and how to best support your Asian students and families, it's all here. So they recently changed their name from Teaching for Tolerance to Learning for Justice. So this video is going to talk about some of the resources they provide and why they made that name change. So let's take a quick look.
Hi, my name is Jalea Lyles Dunn, and I'm delighted to introduce myself as the new director of Learning for Justice. You likely know us by our original name, Teaching Tolerance. 30 years ago, when our program was founded by the Southern Poverty Law Center, its goal was clear: eradicating hate by fighting intolerance in schools. Celebrating diversity and promoting content theory were key to that early work. And focusing on the difference one teacher could make, we offered resources for creating classrooms where all children could thrive. Over the years, even we have admitted that tolerance was an imperfect term. We justified our name by applying the term broadly, saying no single word quite captured the range of solutions needed to create a fair, equal society. And we're proud of the work we've done. But our approach and our work have evolved, and our goals have shifted as well. We know that justice is the heart of what we want for our young people and for society at large. Since our work began, we've expanded our focus. Our social justice standards bolstered our celebration of identity and diversity with attention to questions of justice and strategies for student action and collective action. We've broadened our community. Along with classroom teachers, we work with administrators, counselors, librarians, support staff, teacher educators, and more. We're planning to start working with caregivers and communities too. We also know that the health of our society largely depends on the state of things in the South. And that's why we're planning to become more deliberate about our work in the South, along with the rest of the Southern Poverty Law Center. This moment, with ongoing racial injustice and blatant white supremacy on display, we're digging in our heels even more to work for justice and support our democracy. We're building on the work we do alongside educators to fight for justice in U.S. schools. Together, we're teaching the hard history of American slavery. We're promoting policies that ensure queer students are safe on campus. We're navigating critical conversations with young people about race, gender, class, and more. We're advocating for sanctuary schools where students and their families won't be afraid of deportation. We're offering guidance on procedures and policies to interrupt a school-to-prison pipeline that disproportionately removes Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students from their classrooms, their families, and their communities. The fact is, tolerance is not justice. It isn't a sufficient description of the work we do or of the world we want. But when we are choosing our new name, we weren't only thinking of the changes we want to see in schools. We were also thinking of how to best make these changes. That's why we're shifting from teaching to learning. Because we want to recognize that we don't have all the answers. We want to name that we are learning alongside you as you work for the changes that students, families, educators, and districts need to ensure that our schools are places where all students can thrive. Because we understand that this work will outlast us. And we want you to know that we promise to be in this work together with you. Because we want to honor this truth, that learning from and with one another is the first step to making justice real. We're so grateful to have all the members of our community who have supported us, encouraged us, and pushed us to find a name that better reflects the work we do. We hope you're as excited as we are about the name we've chosen and about the incredible work we know we'll do as we continue learning for justice together.
So So I will stop there. Thank you for putting the link for Learning for Justice in the chat. And I thank you all for your time. I know I'm 5 minutes over and want to be respectful, but I will definitely get some resources together and share those with Rob and Michelle so that everyone will have them to kind of keep the conversation going. But thank you so much for your time and your engagement, especially in the evening. This is phenomenal. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Sierra, so much for your time and wisdom and resources and everything that you have shared. It was a very powerful evening, and we're really looking forward to having you back again in April. So hopefully all of you that are here tonight can share out this video with your colleagues and encourage them to register for part 2 so that they're ready for part 2 of the conversation. And, you know, hopefully some of these conversations can begin to happen or some of these tasks can be taken or shared with administrators before the next time that we meet again. So thank you so much, Sierra. There was, let's see. I'm just checking if there's any last minute questions. Thank you again, everyone, for giving up your evening. I know the weather was beautiful, but thank you so much for joining this very important conversation that we had tonight. So many compliments, Sierra, just tons of people saying thank you and how powerful it was. There is a question that says, I'm so intrigued by your social justice class for middle school. Did you use Learning for Justice for your curriculum, or do you have other resources that we could use with our students in classes?
Yeah, I think that is the one that I primarily used because it is so highly vetted by teachers, by academics and researchers. So that was definitely my kind of primary resource for developing curriculum. This hasn't been widely released yet, but Newsela now has an anti-racism and anti-bias curriculum. So I will share some information on that as well. It's brand new, so I don't have any experience with it, but from what I've seen, it looks really good.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. I don't see any more questions in the chat box, but there is a spot on your registration that you can, you know, enter comments and things if you have any questions for next time. But again, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again in April. I know that the link was posted for mini grants, and so we would encourage you, you know, feel free to apply for mini grants that could maybe help you with some of these resources for your building. And if you are looking to come to our in-person conference this May, just a reminder that our early bird registration ends next week. So check out our website. We'll be sharing out this video link and all the resources and links and information with you shortly. Feel free to share that with, again, your colleagues. And we just thank you again. So thank you, Sierra, for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Sierra.
Of course. Thank you for the invitation.
That was great. Great information.
Sierra, this was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Michelle, I'll see you tomorrow and we can chat about this and other things OMLA related.
Yes, tomorrow at 3. And then John, a couple of us are going to stay on to talk about conference for a couple minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know Brittany and Kristen and Meredith, we're going to chat about some presenter bags. So